Why do you say that most movie ideas are very simple?
Well, I think movies tend to be based on really simple stories. One of the things that newer writers can end up doing without realizing it is overcomplicating their stories, right? Because they feel like, especially if they start writing without a solid outline and they kind of get stuck, they feel like, oh, I have to add more complications to give me more story to write. And they'll end up making things overly complex, where, the movies that we tend to see are pretty straightforward stories. They're, a concise setup, some good escalations in the middle, and then a wrap it up in the end. And it's the execution that makes things entertaining and interesting, right? So it's not that we need very complex stories in movies. A lot of times, overly complex stories will be kind of hard to follow, a little bit bloated. It'll be hard to kind of really go deep in a character's experience in a story that has too many complications or too many characters. Whereas typically in movies, what we see is like, one person pursuing one thing. And what's interesting or entertaining about it is the way that that sort of is executed. The interesting cinematic, cool stuff that happens along that journey, which is actually a pretty simple journey, but it allows us the kind of space to dive into how that character is transforming, the emotional experience of it, and kind of like the cool cinematic stuff that happens along the way.
Does a simple idea mean a boring screenplay?
No, I don't think so. I think if you look at most movies, it's actually a very simple storyline, right? It's a pretty straightforward, one person trying to achieve one thing. I think a lot of times newer writers maybe worry that their stories are too simple and that will make them boring. But if you have a simple story, that just gives you a nice sturdy framework to tell your story, and then it gives you the sort of space and the freedom to find the entertaining moments and cool stuff in the execution of that story, if that makes sense.
Right. And I know you've said, and I don't know if it was in the book or it's in an interview, that the cliche of sort of like the pretty but doesn't know it, or the hot mess that sort of is rescued,
Right.
that's been done so much, and I agree. But what if somebody really needs to stick to the rom-com where high school reunion and best friends getting married, and does anybody object? But they want to do the next Memento, or they want to do the next Crash, something that takes a little more putting together, and you guide them and say, maybe you're not totally ready for that yet.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, right? There are some stories that are, I don't know if I would call them more complex, but the execution of them is more advanced, right? Like Crash is intersecting storylines kind of all put together within the structure of a feature film. I would call that like sort of advanced craft kind of movie, right? So I don't think that that's necessarily an overly complicated story at all. And there definitely are newer writers who love movies like that and who want to write something like that, and that's what's inspiring them and sort of getting them in front of the computer to write it. I certainly wouldn't discourage them. I do think that when you're learning, it's going to be easier to learn and to sort of understand, to wrap your brain around like how to put a screenplay together if you work with a simpler story or a more sort of straightforward, mainstream kind of story with one main character who's sort of pursuing one main goal in the story. That'll be easier just to learn on, if that makes sense. It's like when you're learning to drive a car, if you learn on an automatic, that's a little bit easier than like learning how to shift and learning how to drive at the same time. Not that it can't be done, but it just might take a little bit longer, right? It might take a little more patience. So yeah, I think that if you have the desire to write something like Crash or like Memento, if you are willing to be patient with yourself and give yourself the time to sort of figure out how to write that particular screenplay, then great. Different people are motivated by different things. So if that's what's going to get you to show up and keep trying and keep learning your craft, then go for it. Just know that it might be a longer process because you're sort of learning lots of different skill sets at the same time. And learning how to write a screenplay is already a bunch of different skill sets, sort of put together. So that's just adding a little bit more to your plate, but it can be done for sure.
Sure, I love that analogy. So the driving the car. So it's like learning to drive in your dad's old station wagon versus some sporty little foreign model with a clutch on a hill.
Right, right, exactly.
And you've never driven before, and you have all these people behind you honking. So
Yes.
yeah, that makes sense. That's
Yeah,
a good,
yeah. But if you're in that situation, I mean, if that's what sort of inspires you to learn how to drive, right? Then go for it, and just know that you're going to have to be, you know, sort of gentle on yourself and patient with yourself, because it's probably going to be, you know, frustrating. But if you love the story, that's okay. You might have the patience to kind of get through that, right?
Do you think audiences, though, really resonate more with simple stories, or no, as long as it's a well-told story?
Yeah, I think as long as it's a well-told story. I think simple stories, the benefit that maybe they offer to audiences and to writers too, is that they, you know, when I say a simple story, I mean sort of like the plot framework is fairly straightforward, and what you're able to bring to that as a writer is finding new ways that maybe the, you know, sort of tropes that we expect from the genre, those things are executed in a new, interesting, entertaining, you know, cinematic sort of way, right? So you're bringing you're not writing the boring screenplay just to make it easy for yourself. You're choosing a story that gives you a framework that is easy to wrap your brain around, so that you can bring the creativity to it and add the entertaining stuff on top of it. And then the other benefit is that, you know, with a somewhat straightforward plot, I don't want to say it's too straightforward, but if with a simple plot framework that allows you to then, you know, come up with the cool reversals and interesting twists and turns and all that stuff. The other thing that you can that gives you is sort of the space and the freedom to develop the character more, right? Because if you are taking less time to explain the way the plot is working or why, you know, complications are happening the way they are, it gives you room for the characters to feel things and to interact with each other and to transform and be affected by what they're going through. And it gives you kind of some space for us to have that experience along with the character, if that makes sense.
It does, and I know we've talked about Bridesmaids before, and you use it as an example in the book. And what seems like a simple story, when you actually put these relationship dynamics, it's actually much more complicated and very interesting.
Yeah, and that's a good example. I think that Bridesmaids is a simple story, right? It's a very clear story framework that they're working within, but they have all these lovely, funny, you know, set pieces that are inventive that we haven't seen before, right? So that's in the execution that they're able to kind of, you know, they have this sturdy foundation that they're building on top of, but it gives them the freedom to do really fun, funny, entertaining things. And we also, because the plot framework is so sturdy and easy for us to kind of understand what's happening, you know, you get that character that is nicely developed over the entire movie, which, you know, you might not expect that in a broad comedy, right? But there's a lot of feeling there too. She's really going through something in that story. So
yeah, there's a lot of levels, and it's about the outward appearances, and trying to kind of keep up with friendships and your peer group and stuff. And so yeah, it's a movie that when I first heard about it, I was like, yeah, that's not for me. And everybody was like, oh, you got to see Bridesmaids. I'm like, no. And then I finally saw it, and I'm like, why was I resistant to it? Because it's excellent. So.
Yeah, that's one of those I can watch over and over again because it's so entertaining, and there is so much sort of genuine, you know, humanity in it as well. So.